Damages due to this year's wild hurricane season put the number over $40 billion. Be sure to check ready.gov for ways that you can make your family more resilient to next year's hurricane season. Number 3, is it getting hot in here? 2020 global temperatures may tie or exceed the current record holder, 2016, which was the last big El Nino Southern Oscillation event. This isn't particularly surprising, given that the last 6 years have all been among the hottest on record. The 2010s have been the hottest decade on record, and many reconstruction efforts of Earth's climate over the last several thousand years suggest that this century is among the warmest we've ever experienced. The WMO released a report suggesting that 2020 global temperatures may break 1 degree Celsius warming above the pre-industrial period, bringing us ever closer to the 1.5 Celsius target set by the Paris Climate Accords. Locally, Virginia's 2020 may go down as the top 5 warmest year on record during the warmest 5 years on record. Here in Richmond, it's also looking like a top 5 finish. All right, number 4, wacky freeze season. Locally, we've experienced the latest last freeze of the winter, or the last evening where temperatures hit 32 degrees Fahrenheit or colder on record at the Richmond airport, after what would have been the earliest. I know that sounds confusing. Let me break it down. Our last freeze of the winter occurred on May 10th, an uncharacteristically late date, as our last freeze typically happens in early April or even late March. Long-term warming of the climate here in Richmond and everywhere else has favored earlier and earlier last freeze dates. On the other side of the summer, our first freeze of 2020 was really late. It finally dropped below the 32 degree Fahrenheit threshold on November 18th. Last century, first freezes typically occurred the 3rd or 4th week of October. Nowadays, they're moving ever later into the autumn, consistent with a changing local climate, and with large cascading impacts on our local flora and fauna. Ending on a positive note, the Commonwealth is leading in the climate change policy world by enacting the Virginia Clean Economy Act, which sets Virginia to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050. While these plans currently fall short of benchmarks set by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change over the next few years and decades, and some environmental and business groups have their reservations about particular aspects of the policy, the Virginia Clean Economy Act represents one of the largest leaps forward in energy policy for any state in the entire country. And it promises to serve as a model for other states looking to transform their carbon footprint and take action on climate change. Thanks so much for watching our video on the top 5 climate stories of 2020. Be sure to check out smv.org for more about climate change in the Commonwealth.
All right, so thanks for making that video, Jeremy. It has been incredibly helpful to us this week as we have started to discuss climate change and its impacts here in Richmond. And I don't want to put you on the spot, but did want to say for those who were signing on before the video started or after the video started, seems like as an update to that 2020 turned out to be in the top 5 years as far as heat and precipitation for Virginia, according to all of the data. So today we're going to be talking about what we are seeing here in Richmond, and then preparing to talk about what we can do about that. So as I bring up my slides for today, I did want to mention that we have a special guest as well with us today. Christina, we can definitely share the link to the video with you. Marshall Dewar-Balkind is on the call today. He is a consultant who has worked with our office actually for a few years now on things related to greenhouse gas emissions modeling, and he's also helping to guide our working groups through the process to assess how climate change could potentially impact our community. And we'll be hearing more from him once I get through some of these sort of preliminary content slides. So thank you for joining us, Marshall. All right, so your role today, our ask of you, is to help us conduct a part of our climate vulnerability and risk assessment. And I'll be talking more about what that is and how we're going to do that today. But just know that this is going to be primarily a listening process for us as the RVAgreen 2050 team. And we want you to come into this activity with your knowledge and experience, wherever that comes from. So we will be getting into some technical information today. And different people in this group are experts on different things, but at any time, just feel free to fall back on the fact that you are all humans who live in or around Richmond and are experiencing these impacts along with the rest of the community. So, as a little bit of background, and some recap from what we've already covered in previous meetings, climate change, as you all know, is the shift in the long-term average weather pattern, and it's being caused by human activities. The big sources of greenhouse gas emissions that are contributing to the warming of the atmosphere are from buildings and the energy it takes to run those buildings, transportation, and waste. And those categories of greenhouse gas emissions apply also here to the local Richmond context. And what we're seeing because of the warming of the global atmosphere are various impacts here locally, which include higher temperatures, and more precipitation. And I'll talk more about those in a minute. So this is some data, again, thanks to Jeremy and all his work that he's been doing, that shows what we might be looking at in terms of our future weather here in Richmond. So we are going to be considering the impacts of climate change in two sort of broad categories. One is on the temperature side, and really what we're talking about is heat. And what we've been seeing is higher average temperatures each year, more hot days over 95 degrees, and more extended heat waves, which a heat wave here means any 3-day period where it reaches 95 degrees or above each day. And then we have a category of potential impacts that we're looking at around water. So we're seeing more frequent and intense precipitation events, and more of that precipitation is falling as rain instead of snow. Like I said, we are already seeing these impacts right here in the Richmond region. These are some news articles that we've been collecting since RVAgreen 2050 was announced as an initiative by Mayor Stoney back in 2017, just showing both on the data side and anecdotally that some of the changes that we're seeing, which include things like earlier and more intense pollen seasons, which can be particularly impactful for people with respiratory illnesses. We're seeing things like flooding in places where it's never happened before. Obviously seeing hotter temperatures, more dangerous heat during the summer, as well as more dangerous storm and flooding events. So that's what's happening. Why does all of that matter? What we're worried about is how these longer term impacts and their shorter term sort of symptoms or shocks are potentially impacting Richmond's residents, the people here in our community, as well as our built assets and infrastructure, our natural resources, and the critical services that are provided by all of those things. And that's what we'll be getting into more of today. Particularly, what we want to think about in particular is the impact of climate change on human health. This is a graphic from the CDC that just shows the broad range of impacts that are being seen because of climate change on humans, and then on the right, just a couple of those articles highlighting, things happening right here in Virginia. So this is definitely a global problem, and we're seeing local impacts as well. So that's climate change. What we're seeing here in Richmond, as Jeremy says, it's getting hotter and wetter. This is why it matters, because it's impacting our community and our built assets and infrastructure and our natural resources. So what do we do about it? As you all know, and as we've been repeating each meeting, I think, RVAgreen 2050 is an initiative where we are planning for both the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, which are contributing to that global warming of the atmosphere, as well as acknowledging that even if we were to reduce all of our greenhouse gas emissions here in Richmond, we would still be seeing the impacts of climate change here locally, and those impacts are projected to get more intense. around all of that, of course, is our focus on equity, and particularly racial equity. So what we'll be doing as part of our climate resilience planning is conducting this climate vulnerability and risk assessment. The first step in that process is to understand how climate change is impacting Richmond. So again, thanks to Jeremy and the Science Museum and a bunch of other people who are much smarter than me, we have all of this great data on what our future weather will look like. What we're going to do today with you all is take that information and think about how those impacts, those changes in our weather and our longer term climate patterns could impact our people, our communities, our built assets and infrastructure, and also our natural resources. So we're going to be concentrating today on what could the potential vulnerabilities and risks be. And then what we'll do, looking forward to our next meetings in February and also early March, is actually starting to develop strategies and solutions to address those vulnerabilities and risks and enhance our community's resilience to climate change. So in a little bit more detail here, again, that three-step process, we are looking at the impacts of climate change in two broad categories: heat and water. So on the heat side, just more general extreme heat, more dangerous heat, more frequent, intense, and longer heat waves. And then on the water side, a few things. We're seeing more frequent and intense rain events, which are contributing to both river flooding, but also flooding in places not near the river, in neighborhoods. And then not on this list, but also as part of this, the considerations around climate change is sea level rise. Obviously, Richmond is not a coastal community like some of the places in Virginia that are experiencing more extreme sea level rise. But we will be seeing some impacts of sea level rise to the James River, just up to the falls of the James, which is around the Mayo Street or 14th Street Bridge. And what we're concerned about there is, although those are projected to be relatively minor increases in the James River levels, once you combine that with this increased precipitation and flooding, what could the overall impacts be to the areas around the river? So we'll be taking all of that information on what's happening because of climate change and thinking about the risks to our people, our built assets and infrastructure, and our natural resources. I'm going to be probably using the term assets more generally here, just to encompass all of the things that we're thinking about with that. And the process that we'll be going through today, which we will walk you through in detail in our breakout rooms, but just as an overview, we'll look at three elements of vulnerability and risk to these climate change impacts. So for broad areas of built assets and natural resources, we will be considering sensitivity, or how much a particular asset or system could be affected by something like extreme heat or a flood. On the flip side, we will also be considering adaptive capacity. So is there anything within that particular asset or system that naturally helps it be able to bounce back or recover from that threat? With this, my mind immediately goes to places in coastal communities, for example, where there are buildings on stilts. So even if there is a flood, those buildings are able to adapt to something like rising floodwaters. And then the third component that we'll be addressing today with you all is consequence. And this is the most detailed. What we're going to be thinking about is the complete failure of an asset or system. The reason we take this kind of doomsday approach is because we're not all experts in this, and so it's a little bit easier to think about worst case scenario here. And also we're thinking about relative consequences in some of these areas that are listed here. So thinking about the broader impacts of, something like heat on a particular asset like hospitals or flooding or something. what are the broader repercussions for our community, especially those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change already. What are the literal costs for, repairing damage? And what are the impacts to some of the other critical systems that our city depends on, like public safety, our local economy, public health, and natural environment? So again, we'll be walking through all of that with you. I also want to note that there's a fourth element of vulnerability that we won't be assessing with you today, but we are doing internally, which is looking at probability. And this is thinking through, based on all the data we have, what neighborhoods, what built infrastructure and natural resources are actually in harm's way because of these threats. So we'll be looking at where our urban heat islands are, where we're seeing hotter temperatures already, where we are seeing flooding already, where our floodplains are, and things like that, so that we can combine that with the feedback that you all provide today to say, okay, this is what is likely to, more likely to happen. Then in our next few meetings, we'll be addressing strategies and solutions to helping to build resilience. So just as an example of the kind of discussions that you all might have today with us, wanted to walk through these three elements of vulnerability with an example of one of the asset types. And again, that is a broad term that we'll be considering today, which is our tree canopy. So obviously, as you all know, even better than I do, our trees here in Richmond provide really critical services, not only on the natural side, but also on the human health side in terms of providing shade and benefits for air quality, as well as our local economy. So as we think about things like, for example, flooding, on the sensitivity side, trees are potentially in danger because of something like a flooding event. On the adaptive capacity side, I think trees probably have some sort of built-in resilience. Lots of trees have been here longer than us and survived floods, but it depends on probably the intensity of the flood event itself. And then on the consequence side, as far as trees, we know the failure of something like our tree canopy, which we kind of have to be a little imaginative as to what that might look like. But obviously, that would have huge consequences for our natural environment, probably relatively moderate impacts for our public health and public safety, and then lower impacts potentially to something like our economic activities. Now, as hopefully you were noticing as I was walking through that, a lot of this is thinking hypothetically. It's also thinking somewhat loosely. So a couple things we want you to keep in mind today is that this is not a scientific or perfect exercise. We're asking everyone to come into this activity with whatever knowledge and experience you feel comfortable sharing. So some of us will know more about some of these assets than others. But as I said in the beginning, feel free to just fall back on the fact that you are a human and will be impacted by some of these things in addition to your community being impacted. Also, we don't have time today to get into the nitty gritty of any one individual asset, as we might call it. But if you'd like to do that, we have a couple outlets for that. We will have a way for you to provide written feedback today. And we are also happy to meet with you one-on-one or in a small group later to get all of your valuable input. And then lastly, we don't want you to get too bogged down by what will happen. Climate science, in my understanding, is changing consistently. I think there's been a pattern of projections for climate impacts to be worse than they were thought previously. So we're relying on the data we have now, but also we're thinking about, worst case scenario, what could happen here in Richmond to our people and our infrastructure. And then, of course, we'll scale back from that to think about realistic solutions for enhancing our resilience. So as we go into our activity in a few minutes, we will have a few tools that will be available to Marshall and I as facilitators, as well as you all in our discussion. The primary tool that we will be providing to you is a survey tool through SurveyMonkey, which is your primary outlet for providing your feedback today. If we were doing this exercise not in COVID times, we'd be doing it in a room together at big tables with big pieces of paper and Post-its and stickers and maps and markers and all kinds of things. So we're trying to adapt that to the virtual environment, obviously. So the SurveyMonkey tool, which we will walk you through, is your primary way of letting us know what you think about the topics we'll discuss. And then we will also have a few other things. We sent ahead of time a 2-page kind of overview of what we're talking about today, and that can serve as a reference in addition to these slides, which have a lot of the key definitions and terms we're using. We also have some maps or an interactive map, which can help to orient us to some of the assets that we're talking about. And then in each of our breakout groups, we will have members of our team helping us to take notes so that we are capturing not only your survey and written feedback, in addition to the recording of the meeting, but also the general discussion that happens in our breakout rooms. So the last thing I'll cover is backing up a little bit, thinking about how today's activity and what we're talking about fits into the bigger RVAgreen 2050 process. So as we've said, RVAgreen 2050 is an initiative, planning initiative to at the nexus or connection points of equity, particularly racial equity, climate action, or the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, and climate resilience, where we are preparing for the impacts of climate change. And at each of these three nexus points or elements, we are bringing in tools to help you all and help us prepare draft solutions or strategies, which will later go out to the community for their input. So the equity screening tool that we've spent the last couple meetings talking about is an example of one of those tools, and the climate vulnerability and risk assessment that we'll walk through today is an example of another one. We will be bringing all of that into our work over the next few meetings as we draft strategies, combining that with your knowledge and lived experience, and then taking those draft strategies out to the broader community in April. So that is broad overview of what we'll be covering today. Marshall's going to be getting into more of the details of our activity, but before we move on to that, are there any questions about climate change, which I hesitate to ask because Jeremy's the expert, not me, but I can try to answer as best I can, or generally what we're covering today and how it fits into the RVAgreen 2050 process. And Kyla, if you could let me know if there are any questions in the chat, that would be great. I will give 5 seconds for any questions.
The only question was for you to share the video.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And thanks.
But I think Jeremy has already added. Jeremy, is that the link that you added? Yeah, so that's taken care of.
Perfect. All right. All right. Well, then with that, I will pass it over to Marshall.
There we go. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Okay. You are muted. You are unmuted. Dialogue was delayed. So, all right. So I'll try to not take up too much more time here, because what we're really here to do is talk and share insights with one another. So I'll try to be brief about this. So as Brianne has laid out very extremely well, she always does, we're assessing here vulnerability and risk. Again, vulnerability being a function of sensitivity and adaptive capacity, and risk being about the likelihood something's going to happen and the impact of that, or probability and consequence. We're looking at probability independently, but really when it comes to these other three areas, sensitivity and the ability of a system to adapt and the consequence of impacts, the knowledge is really in the community. It's in all of you, in your work and your experience, that we really need in order to be able to make this assessment, because you know these systems better than most, and that's why part of why you're here. So we'll be looking at each of those three elements for two sets of climate impacts. Again, we're broadly grouping it into heat threats and water threats. And then we'll be going through, we've grouped all of the environment and natural assets we're looking for into 5 sort of broader groups, just in the interest of keeping a discussion focused. We stormwater and sewer infrastructure first, then water supply infrastructure, drinking water, the potable water supply, trees and vegetation, protected areas and natural habitats, and then green spaces and community spaces. And for each of those 5 areas, we'll take between 10 and 20 minutes, or 10 and so depending, to go through first sensitivity and then adaptive capacity and then consequence, looking at both heat and water threats. And I find people sort of we'll try that again, it's just to give a little bit of structure. People's thoughts do move naturally from one of those to the other, and that is okay. And we'll capture all of that feedback. We'll be capturing feedback in 2 forms. Thank you. First, we'll be capturing it through a group discussion in talking all of us, and then through individual feedback through a survey that everyone will have open at the same time. And here is the link to the survey in the chat. And so the idea is that in one window, you'll have the survey, the other window, you'll have our Zoom meeting, and everyone will be filling out the survey individually as they go through. The survey is pretty simple, so it's easy enough to fill out while you're talking, while other people are talking. And the idea here is to capture both the general consensus and your individual thoughts. And if you don't need to feel obligated to reflect reflect the general discussion in your feedback on the survey or your comments. That's really for you and your own thoughts there. And there's a not sure option for everything, but we really, as Brianne said, do want you to bring your lived experience, whether it's from your work or just as a citizen living in Richmond, to this. Our key goals: capturing this information on sensitivity, adaptive capacity to impacts, capturing level of consequence. And in thinking about consequence, I want to stress that we're thinking about both chronic threat, stress, and acute shock. So both the ways in which a warmer climate, a wetter climate, a more volatile climate degrades the ability of, in this case, a natural system or a built infrastructure, say stormwater, to adapt over time, and makes it more vulnerable that when an emergency happens, it is very severely impacted. So we're looking at, but I think everyone, when we think about climate adaptation and we think about natural disasters, we go immediately to emergencies, big hurricane, for example. And that is, I think, a key element of consequence, but we also want to think about this degradation over time that can happen from chronic stress. We want to think about both the strengths and the vulnerabilities of our community. There may be areas where, due to past investment or favorable natural conditions or other things, we may be well positioned, relatively speaking, on something, and that's a good thing to capture. So feel free to say that too. I think there's a lot of gloom to be had on climate change, but it need not be all gloom. And I've been saying this for every case. We're thinking here about physical assets, but also people, and the impact on people and on natural systems. So whether or not that has to do with the flooding impacts from stormwater, or the urban heat island with tree canopies, or the impact of community spaces, green and community spaces on people's lives and well-being, the impact on citizens is a key element here. Having said that, it's a lot of goals, so I hesitate to add any additional outcomes, but there are a few other things we're sort of hoping that you'll gain out of this conversation, that will all sort of come out of it. The first is this mutual knowledge exchange. We're really trying to get your insight here, but we think you'll all, I've found in the other group meetings here, and I think you'll find today too, that you'll learn a lot from one another, and that itself is valuable. Out of this conversation, we'll get information that will allow us to better prioritize the systems and assets with the adaptation strategies. We're not drafting strategies today. But we will have strategy drafting sessions in future meetings, and that will be very much informed by the priorities that emerge out of this conversation and the feedback we get today. We'll also potentially identify co-benefits of adaptation. Wetlands and their impacts come to mind on, flooding, but also, like, for example, if we're planting more trees, there's job impacts there's human health impacts, et cetera. So co-benefits are good. The key actors that will be needed to actually take action on something will be coming out of the conversation. And then finally, I think I want to invite you all, as you go through this and then you leave and you reflect on this event later, to think about how this kind of future planning and thinking about climate adaptation affects your own work and affects the work of your constituents. So this is something you can bring into your daily work and other planning work you might be doing. So that's the general overview of what we're going to do today. We'll be splitting out into 2 breakout groups after a short break. So it's one. Are there any questions before we go?
Hey, hi, here I am. Here I come, Brienne. We've done pretty well. I think we're almost 40 minutes into the meeting without my having said anything.
We didn't give you a chance, Rob.
I know, and good luck with that. So I'm sorry, the fellow who's just speaking, what's your name? Marshall. Give me a little bit of a sense of your background, and then also I want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page here, because when I'm looking, can you go back to the last slide, please?
Yeah.
Key goals, and we're going down and down and down and down, and we're thinking about physical assets, but also people. A big chunk of what we've been trying to do and how we've been focused on this has been about equity in the climate space, and typically that's all about people. So I'm trying to kind of figure out how to put those two things together. When I think, and again, I mean, we're going to do small group work, and I'll get to say this in my small group, but I do want to understand it in the larger group before we go into that work. I think about impacts on people and communities and what happens when it gets hot and people go to the hospital and all these kinds of things. And so I'm just curious sort of where that kind of analysis fits in the process that we're about to undergo.
Thank you. I'll take that. So to answer your first question first, I am an independent consultant. I work on climate modeling. Primarily, I work on the mitigation side. So I've done a lot of the modeling looking at various scenarios and actions that Richmond could take, and the greenhouse gas impacts that we get from benefits we get from reduced emissions out of those actions, and also working with thinking about the co-benefits for adaptation. Prior to becoming a consultant, I worked for about 7 years for DC local government in Washington, DC, doing this kind of energy and climate planning work. So that's my background in brief. I want to say I didn't mean by writing physical assets, but also people, to be at all dismissive of people and the equity. These slides have been iterating over, I think, 5 meetings now. And I think that one got added because I felt like people were thinking very much about, say, the electrical grid, but not the impact the outage of the grid has on people, for example. So I think we want to be taking an equity-centered approach. We want to be thinking about the impacts on people. That is critical, especially when it comes to questions around consequence. But when it comes to questions around the sensitivity of a system or its adaptive capacity, in some cases that will also involve people, and in some cases it may be a more physics-based, question. So I think we want to be thinking about both throughout. Brianne, do you have anything you want to add there?
Yeah, I was just, thank you, Marshall, and thanks, Rob. Definitely want to keep that top of mind today. And I think it will naturally, as we have these discussions, because it's difficult to think about just one of these things in a vacuum of, physical being. in terms of the overall evaluation of vulnerability to climate change in Richmond, our office started this whole thing 2 years ago by creating the Climate Equity Index, which looks at the 39 demographic and health factors associated with people and their potential risk because of things like heat and natural disasters. And that's how we identified the neighborhoods that are potentially on the front lines of climate change, that are also historically disadvantaged communities, and where we are focusing a lot of our efforts in terms of engagement. With this, and then this part of the overall assessment that we're doing today is looking primarily at the beginning at physical built infrastructure and natural resources, but the key part of that discussion will be thinking about how the threats of climate change that will impact those things then impact people. And we'll be working all of that into the discussion of each asset type in our breakout groups. So I hope that helps.
I'll take it. Curious to about, well, we'll keep rolling. I'll play along.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Rob. Any other questions for now? This is helpful to have in our big groups, and we'll have a lot of discussion time in our small groups as well. All right, hearing/seeing none. We're going to take a 5-minute break. Come back at 1:46, and we will be going into our breakout rooms. Thanks, everybody. And we'll also stick around if anyone has questions. I lied. I need to take a break, and then I'll be back. So stop this. I'm going to restart our recording. So I think this is everybody that we'll have. All right. So thank you guys again for being here. We're going to be in our room together for the next hour or so for our activity. what I want to do before I go over a little bit more content, and then we jump into our discussion, is ask that everybody introduce themselves, just for those who might not know each other, and we can get a better sense of who's in the room and who's coming potentially with what kind of knowledge. So you all know me and Kendra with the Office of Sustainability team, and I'm just going to call on people as I see you on camera, or not. Jen, can you just give us your name and organization? And if that doesn't immediately tell us what you work on, tell us that too.
Jen Clark. I work in stormwater utility, a little bit in wastewater and drinking water too.
Thanks. John?
Hi folks, I work for Capital Region Land Conservancy. I'm community engagement manager, so community engagement around land conservation.
Perfect. Wyatt?
Hi, Wyatt Carpenter, VCU Office of Sustainability.
Sorry, Todd?
Hey, Todd Lookingbill. I'm a landscape ecologist at the University of Richmond.
And Justin?
Afternoon, Justin Doyle with the James River Association. I work on conservation and recreation projects.
Awesome. Aaron?
Aaron McFarland, the Enrichment Foundation Tree Lab, growing native tree shrubs and perennials.
Awesome. Wafa May?
Wafa May. I have a company called Self-Made Roots, and I just do a lot of community development and consulting and an environmental background.
Perfect. Bryce?
Hey everybody, my name's Bryce. I'm the superintendent of the James River Park System and deal with the river.
And Chika?
Hey everyone, my name's Chika Anyadike. I'm executive director of a agriculture nonprofit called Renew Richmond, and I also teach at Virginia State University.
Awesome. And I'm trying to multitask here. So Kyla, you should now be a co-host. Did you get that notification?
No, I did not.
Okay, sorry everybody. Okay, I just did it again.
All right, I got it now.
Okay, thanks. And Chika, I'll mention, is also on our round table. So Chika, thank you for doing double duty on these meetings. Okay, so I'm gonna go over a couple more things before we jump into our activity. Oh, and yeah, thanks, John. And Kendra's on our team. Kendra, do you want to introduce yourself?
I'm Kendra. I'm the community engagement coordinator for the Office of Sustainability, and I'll just be taking notes.
Yeah, thanks, Kendra. Okay, so now I'm going to do a relatively quick overview of the areas we'll be covering today during our activity. We can come back to any of this at any time, but wanted to give you all a sense of the kinds of things we'll be considering as we think about the potential threats posed by climate change. So we will be looking at, again, pretty broad categories of built assets and infrastructure, natural resources, as we walk through the survey tool together, which is our actual exercise. The first area we'll be looking at is our stormwater and sewer infrastructure. The reason I put these together is because, as most of you all probably know, we do have a partially combined stormwater and sewer system, and that poses all kinds of fun challenges to deal with when it comes to climate change. Then we'll be turning and looking at our drinking water supply infrastructure, and then looking at natural resources. So we'll be starting with trees and vegetation or pervious surface cover, looking at generally protected areas, which for Richmond is mostly, I think, Chesapeake Bay protection areas, which have certain types of restrictions and on development. And then also within that category, thinking about other natural kinds of spaces and natural habitats. And then last but not least, we will be looking at green and community spaces that are used by people in addition to animal species. So again, we'll come back to all of this. We'll get into these in more detail. I wanted everybody to just get an overview of where we would be with our activity. So I'm going to stop sharing. If you haven't already, please pull up your SurveyMonkey tool. Again, this is for everyone to record your individual feedback through today's activity. So this is your equivalent of your Post-it notes or stickers or whatever we would have given you if we were doing this in a room together. I'm going to walk through each of these sections with you. So if you want to skip ahead, you can. You'll start to get a feel for how we're doing this. And we'll be discussing each kind of area of assets as we go along. So just go ahead and click into the first page. The survey tool is divided into 5 pages based on those areas of assets I just went over. And for each of the 5 asset types or categories, we'll be considering 3 things: sensitivity to climate threats, adaptive capacity, and then consequence. And you can just scroll down the page and see each of those elements. I think as we generally talk about one part of the vulnerability analysis, it will naturally flow into others, which is why we kept it all on one page. Again, this is mostly a hypothetical exercise for today, but we are thinking about Richmond's actual physical and natural infrastructure, the chronic stresses it is already under, and how that could potentially make it more or less vulnerable to something like a climate threat. And then the other tool that I'll share with you is a map that we made, an interactive map. If you're familiar with our climate equity index, it's sort of like a mini version of that. And at the bottom of the screen, you can click on any of the widgets to explore the types of assets that will be, or the climate threats, and then the little leaf icon is some of the assets we'll be covering today. So if, for example, you have no idea, you didn't know that Richmond had Chesapeake Bay protection areas or dams or something, you can click on that one, kind of get a sense for where they are. You might have to zoom in for some of these. I'll say right now the map is not complete. There might be updates that need to be made, but this was just a tool that we put together to help orient us to some of these things. So back to your survey tool, we're just going to go ahead and jump into it. So the first page, obviously, we're going to be thinking about together our city's stormwater and sewer infrastructure. And for this, I wanted to show real quickly this map from the RVA H2O Clean Water Plan, which was put out in 2017, and many of you might have been involved in efforts to put that together or efforts that have been ongoing since then. I know I've seen at least some of you at those meetings. This is showing in red or pink the area of our city where the pipes that take away our stormwater and our sewer wastewater are eventually combined. And so these red dots are points where during flooding events, the system can get overwhelmed and essentially just pump raw sewage into the James River, which is bad. So I'll stop sharing that, but just wanted to show for anyone who is not as familiar with this system, a brief overview. So what we're going to be thinking about is that system that deals with all of our stormwater, which is the water coming from rain events and melting snow that goes into our sewer stormwater system underground, and sometimes doesn't when there are backups and floods. And then also our sewer system and how it might respond to something like a heat wave or threats from flooding. In terms of sensitivity, again, we're thinking more broadly. Just do you think that there is any kind of susceptibility to harm because of something like one of these climate threats? So I'll open it up for any thoughts that you all would like to share, any questions that you have. If there are no questions, I'll also mention that there are obviously several ongoing efforts related to this, both in terms of the RVA H2O initiative. The city is working on a green infrastructure master plan that some of you are involved in. There are a number of community organizations. Jen, you probably have the whole list of lots of other folks in the community that are working on this. So there's definitely a lot happening in terms of thinking about how to better manage stormwater in the city and reduce flooding. But we just want to think about, for right now, sort of current threats, current state of things, and how they might be impacted by climate change.
Can I ask if the Department of Transportation is factored into the discussions here in any way directly?
We don't have someone, hey Monica, we don't have someone from the, well, I should say the city doesn't have a Department of Transportation, but within Public Works, we have several different divisions that work on matters related to transportation. We don't have anyone from those departments on this working group in particular. Jen, do you happen to know if anyone from like Public Works is involved in any of the RVH2O initiatives?
Yes, we do have several DPW folks who are so part of the RVA H2O. I'll take a step back. RVA H2O exists to try to bring all of these players to the table to talk specifically about stormwater, wastewater, flooding impacts, and clean water enrichment in the James at once. It is DPW and DPU have an interesting relationship because DPW operates the right of way and DPU operates the storm drain. And there is some significant overlap, especially when it comes to standing water. The Green Infrastructure Master Plan is helping, like it has a dedicated focus on bringing DPW back to the table. But in the last 7-ish years, it's been harder to get many DPW players at the table as part of the RVA H2O Clean Water Plan. I think that's changing, but it's taking a intense amount of relationship building between those two departments.
Awesome. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. I apologize.
No worries.
I don't want to come in at the wrong place, so to speak, but I would like to encourage some representation from VDOT. I know in a key area where the sewer system runs, there is some challenges that I know I have identified, and so getting all of the players. I've worked with the city, and it's been a really hard time trying to get VDOT to the table, as Jen indicated. So I just wanted to encourage that. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Monica. I'm gonna feel free to put any of that kind of feedback more on like the solution side into the comments on the survey tool. I'm also taking notes in our slides so that we can note this and come back to that when we are at our next meeting, thinking about what kinds of solutions we might want to see to help with these things. Any other thoughts you all are having as you move, thinking still about stormwater and sewer infrastructure as you move into like adaptive capacity? I know this would be, to me, things like, green infrastructure projects where the infrastructure that's dealing with stormwater is naturally able to, adapt to something a little bit better, like a flood event, or can make the city cooler during a heat event, something like that. But any other thoughts or any questions that you all have?
I think it's interesting that in these conversations, like the flood wall doesn't even get mentioned or addressed. Is it, which, would that presumably like fit under this category? I think that's just speaks to that as a solution. I guess I don't is that it's not it's part of the conversation because there's other things like the CSOs that are more primary, kind of pressing front and center. And I don't know. I'm interested if you think of that as part of this, or just it's not even or what your thoughts are.
Yeah, definitely. The flood wall is part of our stormwater infrastructure for sure. So it's not just the pipes and the outfalls and the treatment plant. We have that as a piece of, I would say, definite adaptive capacity as part of our stormwater infrastructure that we can withstand, at least in some areas, the James River rising to levels of 20 feet. What is it?
41.
41 feet. So that is definite adaptive capacity on that side.
But kind of niche at the same time, which is challenging, right? Like that's when, if we had a hurricane or a severe rainfall upstream, we're in good shape, and we're not in great shape if a hurricane sits over Richmond because the city can't deal with more than a couple inches of rain.
Right, that's happening for tributary flooding, right?
And I'll add that one of the things that we are looking at, but is not clear how we measure at this point, is the impact of development west of Richmond happening near the river, which will create more hard surfaces. And as we have these more frequent and intense rain events, and that's falling in Henrico and Goochland and further west, coming into the river, and then kind of coming into Richmond on the James, what kind of impacts that might have. Yeah, I'll just. So again, as Marshall said, this is a gloomy conversation, we know. So hopefully you all have something cheerful planned for after this. And I am going to move us on to the next group of assets in a few minutes. So if you haven't already, please make your way down to the third section of the first page. Again, we're still considering stormwater and sewer infrastructure, but we want to focus on now the third element of consequence, which is thinking about again, hypothetically, total system or asset failure because of something like, let's say, a catastrophic flood event or a hurricane sitting over Richmond for, I don't know, a number of days, something like that. If we were to have some critical piece of this infrastructure or system go offline for some amount of time, what kind of consequences would we be talking about? Feel free to indicate not sure for anything, again, because this is a huge system we're talking about that has many components, so it's a little difficult to estimate like the cost of damage. I have no idea what that would be. I don't, and we can try to estimate that at some point if needed, but what we're more concerned about here is how you all think about the relative impacts to public safety, which is things related to, actual physical safety, or our local economic activities, our natural environment, things like that. Feel free to chime in with any questions or thoughts as you're having them as you fill this out. And Monica, I just wanted to make sure that you got the survey tool link. I'm going to put it in the chat just in case.
I have a question.
Yes.
What do you have in mind when we talk about economic activities? Like, I don't know if I should picture like people going to restaurants or like construction halting for a week. Or both.
Yeah. So with economic activities, the easiest way for me to think about this is to contrast that with the cost of damage category. So with the cost of damage, we're talking about literal funding that we need to repair the thing that was that experienced the threat. With economic activities, we're thinking about everything else. So cost of healthcare, cost of lost wages, lost opportunities from businesses not being able to function as they normally are, all of that kind of stuff. And we know for something like this, the stormwater and sewer infrastructure, because it is the whole city, obviously impacts are most likely going to be high across the board. Again, this is easier for some of our other categories where we might be considering one particular asset or something. But here you can kind of gauge maybe relative consequences in these categories. But again, I feel like they're probably all high, but that's just me.
It's so much fun.
I was going to say, yeah, it seems like it would be very bad. It would be very bad.
Yeah. And what, in case this is helpful, I want to add that what we're going to be doing with all of this feedback is, so we've done this now with all 4 of our other working groups, all looking at different types of assets. So in the transportation group, we were looking at roads, bridges, bike lanes, train tracks, all that. In our buildings and energy group, we were looking at like critical assets like hospitals and police stations. We've been across the board. So we have 100 and something different like asset types we're looking at. And what we're going to be doing is incorporating on all of this survey-based feedback along with what we're getting from the discussions, and then combining that with the actual climate data that we have to create a list of here are the highest priority categories or asset areas or something, to then turn around to you all at our next meetings and say, this is what we heard, these top 20 things, or however it works out, are what we need to include in our plan as far as drafting some sort of solution to enhance resilience. So we know it's difficult to compare something like a hospital to the stormwater infrastructure system, and we're not asking for that necessarily, but we just want to identify where the critical potential threats are. So again, that's all to say. For something like this is such a critical piece of infrastructure that we know this is going to be at the top, so somewhere.
This is Bryce. Just to make a couple of comments on the consequences. If we're looking at part of the James River Park system is at Ancaro's Landing, and it is right next to the wastewater treatment. It's the tidal portion of the James, and a lot of the CSO outfalls are in that area. What we see with a lot of folks in that area is the fishing that goes on. And now it's not all directly tied to the immediate part of it, but there's a lot of folks who are subsistence fishing in that location. So if we did have failure within our wastewater treatment, we would have negative impacts, especially on the populations who rely on food from the river. And then other parts that I see would be just even farther down, and Justin could probably comment a lot on just our wildlife, especially with sturgeon population and other things like that that are trying to make a comeback. And Richmond has a direct tie to the negative or positive impacts that could happen even further downstream. Just throwing those things out there for discussion purposes.
Yeah. Awesome, Bryce. That's super helpful. We are going to be getting into on the species, animal and plant species side. We are going to be talking about that a little bit more in one of our other asset categories. But I'll just say that, frankly, that was one of the hardest areas for me to find information on along the way in this process, was like how climate change is potentially impacting the species that populate Richmond. What are like the critical species to be protected, that kind of thing. So just keep that in mind. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a few minutes, but that was an area we could definitely use some help in. Let's take, if you need it, 2 more minutes on the stormwater and sewer infrastructure section, and then we're going to move to the next one, just to stay on track as far as time. And Justin, I'll say I had some really good conversations about all of this really early on with Ben from JRA. Yeah.
Say regarding species, you could reach out to the Natural Heritage Program at DCR, and they could put together a list of species for this effort. I think could be helpful to you.
Okay. Great, thank you. All right, so for those who are ready, and if you need more time, please feel free to stay in the section. The survey will save your responses as you move along. But for those who are ready, please feel free to click next to our next asset grouping, which is water infrastructure. The distinction here being that we're talking about drinking and potable or potable water. So we have a water treatment plant in Richmond along the river, I think up by on the north side, across from Pony Pasture area, something. There are also pipes that take water to and from our houses and businesses and all of that. And so there might be some other pieces of water infrastructure that I am not familiar with, but that's what we're thinking about when it comes to this part of the analysis. And so what we ask you to think about is the sensitivity of those pieces of infrastructure and that system to heat and water threats. And then same thing with adaptive capacity. I'll just add that because we get our drinking water from the James River, we haven't, that I know of, had historically anyway, a threat to, because of drought when it comes to the amount, like the supply of drinking water, but that is something that the water utility tracks as far as like James River levels and all of that. I think that's about all I know in this area related to water infrastructure and climate change. If anyone knows anything else or has questions, feel free to chime in.
I do know that in 2019, we asked folks to like kind of pull a California and stop watering their lawns at one point. So we do try to take action when it's extremely low river levels, which is to increase the amount of water we have in our reservoirs and at the plant when the James is looking low and when rain isn't in the forecast.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Jen, that's helpful.
No problem. And water loss, like loss of treatment capacity at the plant would also fit in here, like with like boil water notices and stuff like that, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay, cool.
And would that be, boil water notices would be like something is wrong with the water?
Yeah, that might be like that the plant loses the ability to treat water effectively, but you have the capacity to get water to your home still, so it's still flowing, but not as safe as it needs to be to meet EPA standards. Or that could also be like that somewhere in the pipes there's been a contaminant added. It doesn't happen in Richmond, thank goodness, in anyone's recent history memory that I'm aware of, but it would definitely happen like if, like after a hurricane, if the water treatment plant goes down, there's a boil water notice, and then you need to boil your water to eliminate contaminants before using it.
Got it. And do you know, this might be getting too in detail, but if something like extreme heat poses any threat there, I'm thinking about algae growth and like just water quality when we have like really consistently high temperatures and not a lot of rain to clean up.
Yeah, it can. So they keep the water treatment plant like under lock and key because it's both the wastewater treatment plant and the water treatment plant are high security environments because a attack on them could be catastrophic for the Richmond region. There are these like large chambers where the water comes in from the James, but then once it's treated, it goes into this completely like, it's like the most dark place I've ever been, reservoir, where the whole process to get transferred out into your home and other reservoirs starts. Once it's in there, it's got, it is not going to grow algae anymore, and they maintain its pH and chemical balance meticulously. But yes, to the sections, like the intakes. However, there are two. So there's like the original 1928, that year might be wrong, but I don't think it is, water treatment plant side. And then they built an expansion, and they can transfer from one to the other to make plenty of time to clean one section, or if one section goes down, there's this backup.
Awesome, that's helpful, thank you. I'm glad you're here. this is similar to a lot of the other working groups where we cover something and there happen to be, you know, 1 or 2 people who were very knowledgeable. So for example, in a conversation I was facilitating with some stakeholders about energy infrastructure, we had someone from Dominion who knew everything there was to know about power lines. I learned that heat can cause power lines to sag, which in itself is not that huge of an issue. But if you think about a storm coming along or something while power lines are already potentially sagging and not in the place they normally are, that could pose some real problems. So I just find this all very interesting.
But we're not assessing probability here, right? We're not assessing, we're just assessing if this were to happen, like what would be the consequences.
Exactly, yes. We are thinking, again, sort of doomsday scenario here. And Jen, I'm sorry, my last question, if you don't know, then that's totally fine. Do you know if the water treatment plant for Richmond services all of Richmond plus some Henrico and some Chesterfield County places?
Accurate.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. And the some Henrico also flows into, this is late, but some also flows into the combined sewer system.
Yeah,
and then the wastewater treatment plant as well for that reason.
Yeah. Yes.
And those are all under the there's contracts with the other counties that are renewed when their time comes, but they both also have other ways to provide water. They just don't have treatment that's large enough. And we also, one person or entity is also a bottled water company. So sometimes Richmond's water is actually bottled and then sold. I don't remember the brand, but
that's how it was. Yeah. Where I used to live in Connecticut.
That's good to know.
The water was bottled, not like bottled, but like huge bottled, and came from somewhere else in the States. So that's how we got our water. And I thought that was really interesting because we were on the coast. But, okay, so let's take 1 or 2 more minutes on water infrastructure, and then we're gonna start thinking about something completely different.
So Jen, if there's only one water treatment plant, we're not particularly adaptable in that case.
No, my responses were pretty high. But not particularly uncommon for the region, not particularly good either, but no. And then the reservoirs are kind of another part that gave me pause about sometimes we think of that as kind of adaptable because we've got some water in storage if anything were to happen. But what if they all have roofs and stuff to keep the water inside safe, but what if something happened to those? So I'm all for the doomsday stuff, but no, and it's hard because I'm glad that these are specific sections, Brianne, because I mean, my whole job is talking about water and trying to make it not invisible, but we didn't even think about hand washing and water's daily importance until March. So then you think our water goes to VCUs, which goes through another treatment center, but then they can wash their hands, so then they can treat patients. But before that, nobody's thinking I'm sure glad that my tap works every day.
Right.
I feel like water is sometimes forgotten. In one of the other groups, someone mentioned that in these doomsday or apocalypse movies, often the first scenes that are in them is that trash is everywhere in the street because there's no trash service, and cars are everywhere in the road because people just abandon them and there's no, cleanup of vehicles or anything. But I feel like water is the forgotten critical piece of a lot of that, maybe. Or maybe just not as visible. I don't know.
It is forgotten, but I mean, you could, our power goes out and I feel I freak out within a few hours and you wouldn't last long.
Yep. All right. So on that note, wrap up water infrastructure if you can. Feel free to stay if you would like a few more minutes. For those who are ready, please go to the next page if you haven't already, which is trees and vegetation. This is a broad category again, just for time and ease of discussion. What we're primarily considering here, I think, is Richmond's tree canopy, all of the services it provides to us rather than like individual trees, I guess. And on the vegetation side, I'm thinking more here about generally pervious surfaces in Richmond that are also green. So they provide similar benefits to the tree canopy, like cooling effects, benefits for air quality, stormwater management benefits, those sorts of things. So that's what we're talking about here with this set of natural resources. Would love to hear any thoughts on, because we just haven't really talked about this in any of our other groups, how trees deal with things like extreme heat and whether there's things to think about related to like different species of trees and how they handle heat, or things like that. I don't know, as well as water. So any thoughts you all have would be super helpful for this discussion.
I don't know exactly how trees deal with heat in terms of like what they might be doing physiologically, or like in terms of mechanisms, but I think the way I think about climate change is the effect on trees, especially in Virginia, is that we'll essentially see just like a migration of our biospheres going from east to west. So we'll see the coastal plain march toward Richmond, and we'll see the Piedmont region march towards like the western province like area. And a lot of the trees, like trees that we have in Richmond, for example, that are kind of like the maples, for example, that might typically be seen like northern hardwood forests that have been able to survive here in the Piedmont region will probably start to struggle. And we'll see more trees that are like characteristic of the coastal plains. So like the loblolly pines and actually if Bryce is still on the call, or Justin, I don't know the answer to this question. If we get any saltwater intrusion in the tidal area of the James, like near Rockets Landing, I would guess the salinity is pretty low there. But if we start to get saltwater intrusion that way up the river, then we would see a pretty drastic change in like what types of species can survive there.
I'll let Justin answer the salinity content, but from my point of view with our trees, I think it's also leaving them up to vulnerability with diseases and invasive trees and plants as well. And we are seeing that with introduced species. We're seeing that with just some of the stressors and with the inundation that we see with the flooding as well. So those are all different components of the climate change that we're seeing in and along the river. I also think in Richmond as a whole, and Brian, the Office of Sustainability and Redlining, we have a large concentration of our kind of green spaces in along the river and a few other parks, but it's certainly not evenly dispersed throughout the city. So that has a negative impact on some of our heat islands that we see. So yes, and I think they're very important. We need to increase it. We also, from our side of things, from the James River side of things, when we are doing new plantings, we're looking at how this area is potentially changing. So like Huguenot flatwater, for example, we're looking at maybe there are a bit more upland species that we had before, but now that we know that there's going to be more flooding events, we're going to be trying to do more water-loving trees in that area, just native, but maybe just shift it a little bit from their traditional spots along the river.
I think if I'm sorry, Justin, go ahead.
Go ahead, Aaron.
Oh, just to touch upon a few points. If I remember correctly, I think there's a certain temperature cutoff in a sense where trees stop. I don't want to say stop doing their work, but they just don't do the same processes of collecting carbon in that. I think it's 86 degrees Fahrenheit or somewhere right in there. So they still do things, but it's not doing the things we want trees to do to collect carbon in that. So anytime we get those really hot days, when it's hot in the peak of the day, the trees are just kind of stable and just making sure they're going to stay alive. So the more days over, obviously over 90 that we get is going to negatively affect how much the trees can do. I also think too with, which I think we kind of get into a little bit, but the plants we're going to see in our areas, I mean, technically like a whole zone shift in the hardiness zones from the USDA. This coming from Tree Lab, which grows all natives, but obviously we'll have to shift our plant palette from our current zones, what we can have, and just look at plants further to our south. Our current plants that natively and naturally have grown here for hundreds of years, obviously will become basically obsolete and can't handle the heat, the flooding events. And even I think we do have to start to think about adopting some more even non-natives into our plant palettes, because I mean, super doomsday scenario, we may get to a point where, hey, only non-natives make it in our area. And if we have to go with it, we have to go with it. They're still going to provide some benefit, and we hope that some plants and other animals can come along for the ride and make a living off of those plants.
Aaron, that is so interesting about the carbon capture of trees and temperature. I am definitely going to nerd out on that later. So thank you.
The other thing to think about with carbon, right, is that it's not just increased temperature, but we don't have to increase carbon dioxide, which will actually potentially be beneficial to some species that can change the species mix for sure.
John, I was going to respond to your comment on salinity. I don't think it's something that we have to worry about here in the city of Richmond. But just so folks know, there is a dynamic where, when we have dry periods of weather, the salt wedge will creep further upriver than it typically does. And then when we have these freshettes, periods of wet weather, that salt wedge gets pushed back downriver. But I don't think it's something that we have to worry about this far upriver.
Thank you, Justin, and everyone. That was super helpful. Love having the tree group on here. So go ahead and take a couple more minutes to digest everything that we've heard. And again, the input that you're putting on the survey tool is your judgments. So take a couple more minutes and complete the trees and vegetation section, and then we'll be moving on to our next asset category. Bryce, if you're still there, I had a question. I've just been taking some notes on the diseases side for like trees and other natural species. Is that because of just general like diseases that can affect natural species, or is that like caused by bugs and stuff?
Yeah, a combination of both there. So the additional stressors, whether it's heat or water or any of the other things that we've been talking about, leave, just like a human, leave you more vulnerable to whether it's insect driven or bacteria, fungus, any of the above. An example, although it is an invasive, will be emerald ash borer with all of our ash trees in the area. We've been trying to treat them, but you are seeing a mass die off as we go throughout. Now, I'm not sure if all of that is climate impacted or just having the emerald ash borer present. And then there have been other blights and other stuff that has been around, but you'll just see the populations more vulnerable to that. And I think another piece of it, we talk about 86 degrees, and it was mentioned earlier with our late freezes or early freezes and stuff like that. It's throwing off our plants and how they go into dormancy and how they're able to prepare themselves for the winter time. And so I think that's also another issue that we're running into.
Thank you. That's super helpful. All right. Lots on trees. Feel free to stay on that page if you want to incorporate more feedback. Again, Kendra and I are both taking notes. So we are capturing the discussion. For those who are ready, feel free to move on to the second to last page. With this one, we're still thinking about natural resources. And I know this is not the easiest sort of grouping of resources to think about, but with this section, we are looking at areas that are protected in the city because of their role in maintaining the health of like the Chesapeake Bay and other watersheds. We are also thinking about other like the water bodies, the things going into the James River and creeks and lakes and wetlands, the James River itself. And then on the terrestrial habitat, this is where we can get more into the animal species part. If you all have any thoughts on this. On the mapping tool, there is a layer for terrestrial habitat. This was more something that I thought was interesting. I don't know what a lot of this means, but just wanted to show, this is from, gosh, where did I get this from? Checking. The Northeast Climate Science Center. Anyway, they were looking at, you know, terrestrial habitats and how they respond to climate change. And so that's where that layer came from. So its accuracy is up to you all to judge. But just wanted to show that there are lots of different kinds of habitats for plant and animal species in the city of Richmond, as you all know. And we are considering all of that with this section of the activity. So would love any thoughts or questions that you all have, and I will do my best to answer if I can.
Floodplains are included or not included here?
I didn't include floodplains more because they are, we do have, what?
Kind of because they're people-centered rather than resource.
Yeah,
okay.
Right. They're more like, they're not there because FEMA cares a lot about the natural environment. They care about, well, whatever they care about, but it's not the natural environment. And Richmond is, FEMA is also updating currently Richmond's floodplains right now. So we have the current floodplains on that map under the climate impacts layer if you all want to look at them. But for this, we're thinking more about areas that are protected because of their like natural state and services and what they provide to the surrounding area.
I'll just make a quick comment in John from CRLC. So James River Park System is not all of it, but a good chunk of it is protected or will be protected under the Conservation Capital Region Land Conservancy. So under an easement where it'll be a continual green space in perpetuity. And in addition to some of the federal and state guidelines, we had to go and put in any projects that we want to increase our impervious surfaces to our partners in CRLC, which would be Department of Conservation and Recreation and some of our community members, and get that approved ahead of time. We had to calculate the impervious surface increase, and we have to stay below a 5% impervious surface throughout the entire conservation easement. So we're starting to see more conservation easements across the city, which is putting just another layer of protection on the green spaces. So it'll be harder to develop those. And I think that is a good thing. But also, anytime that we're doing any projects, we still have to get approval through Virginia Marine Resource Commission and a lot of times Army Corps of Engineers. And so there's a lot of checks and balances in place, especially along the river. Now for the terrestrial part, I'm not as familiar with.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thanks, Bryce. Is the 5% impervious surface criteria something that applies to easements more generally, or is that?
No, generally it's even more strict than that. But
Okay.
Since we just celebrated 10 years of being under an easement last year, and or 2019, and partially it's at that level because there was already impervious surface in place. So in order for us to kind of abide by that, 5% was created, but it can be even less, like 2%. And maybe John knows more. I'm not exactly sure.
I don't know exactly. But Bryce, your point brings up something in my mind of just like when thinking about climate change and its effect on these types of spaces is just considering how much pressure there is going to be on acquisition, on development, on just the use and ownership and access to space in the future. I think we've seen, like, at least anecdotally, I can report that we've seen some of that in our work at CRLC. We've seen so many people kind of like flocking out of the city, out of like developed areas to places that have a bit more breathing room during the pandemic. And it's contributed to the loss of like agricultural land in Virginia, which has been a trend that's been going on for a while now. But I just think that's kind of a big takeaway for me is, at least I'm on I don't know what section we're supposed to be on, but I'm on the green/community spaces section. And that's just something I'm considering is just, we kind of thought about what's going to happen for the species in those areas perhaps, but also just considering like how all the different forces of our society are going to be kind of like all moving towards like thinking about who has land and where is it and what's it going to look like over the next like 10, 20, 50 years.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of related to that, John, in a different way, is I'm thinking about how people will probably need to come to terms with the fact that our outdoor spaces might change over time, like that they'll look different as, a river valley changes, or that not all islands will always be there, and that we can't necessarily just keep them because they were there, as hard as that is to think about. Whether it's, heat wouldn't have that impact the same way that a major flood would, but there's no point at some point, there might be no point of building back something over and over and over again if it doesn't stick around.
Certainly. Yeah. We're seeing that happening on Tangier Island in the bay. Mm-hmm. It's not like a public park per se, but it's it's a community that's trying to save their land that's rapidly going underwater.
Mm-hmm. It's eroding.
That's right. Just wind and waves.
And I don't know how this would really, it's not really like a discrete event that I'm about to like touch on, but I was talking to someone in the environmental studies department at VC recently, and they study genetics and like genetic drift between different populations. So like dogwoods, for example, in cities are bred to be, to do well in full sun, but naturally they're evolved for full shade. And so you see this like genetic drift between dogwoods in urban areas and dogwoods in rural areas. And the same is true for like cardinals, for example, are much brighter red in cities because they have access to bird feeders and a lot more food, but they're actually worse parents. They don't provide as well for their young. And so then there's this like genetic drift between the rural and urban cardinal populations. And so I guess I'm just like thinking about, as Richmond gets warmer, like how those genetic things will continue to evolve and like spill out of Richmond into surrounding areas. I don't know what we would do about that, or like what kind of it's not really a specific event, I guess, but just something that came to mind.
Wyatt, do you think that like pollinators are similar in some ways? Like, what do we do without bees and pollinators? But they're not going to get wiped out because it was hot one day or it rained too much. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's applicable, and with like Aaron touched on a minute ago, having to like rethink what species we're planting in cities, and that the pollinators that we have in Richmond now might be adapted to pollinate, have relationships with species that are no longer able to grow in the area. And so that's probably going to impact them, the pollinators.
Yeah, I would think, just to kind of add on to all that, that that kind of like the more generalist type plants and animals who can adapt to a wide variety of things are going to do relatively fine, but it's the specialists who are, you know, maybe one species of a small wasp that only feeds on a certain insect, or I should say parasitizes a certain insect, or only gets pollen from a certain flower, and that flower relies on that single insect, a lot like some of the orchids in the tropics. We're going to lose that diversity very quickly with the changing climate, because those plants can't necessarily move maybe as easily north or west to cooler areas or drier areas. So I think we'll see a lot more generalist birds, insects, plants who can adapt and easily find food or grow in various conditions do just fine, but we're going to lose a ton of diversity with that.
Thank you, everyone. And I wanted to encourage folks who are ready. We're talking about really all of this, but feel free to move on to the last page of the survey, which is, as John mentioned, getting into the more of the community space side of green spaces. So our parks and public green spaces and community gardens. I put cemeteries on here just because many of our cemeteries do function as public green spaces in many ways, and I wanted those to be included in our analysis. So feel free to walk through that, voice any questions, thoughts you have. I did want to add one additional thought to what you all were discussing just a minute ago, which is, I think it was Aaron or John mentioning the use and the acquisition of space, but also I think as some of these other things we're thinking about, Jen, like the appearance and the use of our community green spaces is something I've been thinking about, at least when it comes to climate migration, which is the migration of people due to climate change. And that's something we are not explicitly including in like what we're talking about today, but certainly given what is happening in our coastal communities in Virginia, you know, I've heard mostly anecdotally, you know, just because I don't have time to read into the studies, that we could see population leaving the coastal areas and coming inland, which would include potentially coming into the city of Richmond, which would put more pressure on things like development as well as community resources. And I think generally for the region, we will continue to see more development in and around the city of Richmond, and you know, our borders are there, but as far as our city borders, but we are highly impacted by what is happening around us in terms of species and all of these things we're thinking about. So don't want to add another layer of complexity, but just wanted to note that that is something we're thinking about at least.
I think that's a great point, Fran. I think there's an additional layer of complexity, that's the interaction between the land use constraints that already exist kind of in these urban places, and this would be relevant to both this and the previous item with biodiversity and kind of looking for protecting habitat and allowing species and habitats to adapt to a changing climate, and any of those adaptation items, adaptive capacities are going to be limited by the existing land use and built infrastructure we have kind of around things. So it's going to limit kind of where we can put new corridors, where we can put new parks, and how we can connect all those things together. So I think there is definitely land use climate change interactive effect that needs to be considered.
Thanks, Todd, definitely.
I just want to say I'm happy you added cemeteries as potential green spaces, because they're basically also preserved forever as open space. And right now, unfortunately, a lot of the city cemeteries are just grass. I know it gets tricky planting trees close to, you know, family locations and burial sites, but I think there's the potential to turn portions of even cemeteries that are filled up into green and community spaces. They're generally quiet, and a lot of people, there's the cemeteries around are big, so there's a potential to have big, basically parks in some areas where there currently are not parks or green spaces.
Thanks, Aaron.
Go ahead, Bryce.
As been mentioned earlier, these green spaces or parks became more valuable than ever this year due to the pandemic, and we saw, just in case you didn't know, James River Park System saw 2.1 million visitors this past year, about 200,000 more than any other previous year. And it's everybody still concentrating in the same areas, and the built-in infrastructure, as Todd had mentioned, we have limited number of parking spots. So that's why we're trying to look at multimodal transportation to be able to get to and from our green spaces easier, safer, and to also have some sort of dispersal effect into the areas, so we don't have to concentrate in our few green spaces. And yes, I agree with the cemetery part as well. I think it's an underutilized piece, and I think there are some creative ways to increase maybe some of our canopy so we don't just have monocultures there and make it a healthier place for biodiversity. But yeah, I think there's a real
Bryce, you cut out for me, but I think we got most of that. So thank you. Jen, did you want to chime in with a thought or question?
It's a blend of thought and probably a little bit too early. I don't echo everything about cemeteries, and anyone who knows me probably knows that I enjoy cemeteries. But my concern, so I can tell you that they rank super high as excellent locations for green infrastructure in Richmond because they often have a lot of impervious surface. They've got roads in them, and a lot of them, they're huge, which is great for meaningful green infrastructure, but they have a reputation for a lot of us that is not a positive place. And so there's not a lot of community support there yet for them to see greening projects necessarily. I think that Richmond is having better luck with that, but when city resources go somewhere, there's not a lot of buy-in by our citizens and people who pay us to do what we do. So we'll see this throughout, I'm sure, when we get to our strategies, but there's got to be something in there where we help people see value in that, even though it's not a place that maybe everybody frequents because they think it's ghosty or something.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of want to add on to that, at least. I'm not sure if anyone on the call has any insight on, I guess, the conversations around the African burial sites and how they've, I guess, like upkeep for them and just like education for the community. I guess just in I'm just thinking about that in like the up until 2050, how those kind of conversations will go from, I guess, an equity-centered lens.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have a ton of feedback for you, but working in Richmond, some of you may know that we own and are currently working on the restoration of Evergreen and East End cemeteries, which is quite a process, and I'm happy to be a small part of it, providing environmental feedback on the site and trees and things, because it was left basically abandoned, so it's a forest now. So it's striking a balance between that space of the environmental side as well as obviously this is a sacred site for families to visit their loved ones, and then also including all of that educational aspects of that, the history of the site. I believe these are things I should know better, but I get buried in the nursery purposely. But I believe we have information on our website about the master plan for the cemetery. But I recognize there's a lot of sites in the state, but also even a few more in Richmond outside of Evergreen and East End that are burial sites that are being found and or reclaimed and hopefully cleared out and made available for visiting and turned into places of respect again. It is a interesting and tricky thing from what I hear internally with some of the feedback we get. But that's definitely another thing that I agree we should keep in mind and look at.
Yeah, thank you both. And Wafame, I think that's a great thing to think about that I honestly hadn't as part of this exercise, but our office is involved in some of the work around the site or sites in Shockoe Bottom. And I think more generally, as we think through, just planning out towards 2050, physically, so many of these sites are in the floodplain because they are in the older areas of the city. And so that's potentially one consideration, but there are also, some of them anyway, very pavement heavy areas in places with high urban heat impacts that could benefit from being community green spaces. So I think there's potential to integrate all three components of our RVAgreen 2050 initiative in terms of equity, mitigation, and adaptation into that conversation. So I'm glad that you brought that up. I did want to note we have about a minute left before we're going to be joined by the rest of the group so we can wrap up. So if you haven't already, please complete your survey to the best of your ability and hit done so that we can record your full response. And while we're waiting for folks to rejoin us, please continue to share any thoughts as well. And I'll just say I really appreciate the discussion today, and thank you all so much for spending this time with us. This has been super helpful, and we look forward to bringing it all back to thinking about the positive side of solutions and strategies at our next few meetings. And I am going to just get my screen shared up. Thanks, Jen.
No problem.
Honestly, when I have this baby, there's going to be no meetings going on anyway. So I'm grateful for whatever time he can give us.
Ditto. Multitasking at its finest.
All right.
Well, I don't know about you, Brianne, but our group definitely ran up against the time wall.
Yeah, we just finished. So welcome back, everybody. I think this is everybody. Wanted to thank everybody for the work that you did in your breakout groups. I hope that discussion was interesting and helpful to you. I know it definitely was for us. And we look forward to turning around in our next couple meetings and thinking about, again, the positive side, thinking through solutions to all of the potential threats and risks and vulnerabilities that we just talked about. We don't have time today to get into our reflection, but I did just want to share that as a closing thought, if you have time, especially as we go into our next meetings, as we think about strategies, feel free to start thinking about your top priorities related to your work or your community, and where you might want to focus some effort around thinking through strategies to enhance resilience in those areas. So just to wrap up, on this activity, please hit done on your SurveyMonkey so that we can record your full response and get all of your valuable feedback. If you think of any additional thoughts after this meeting, please feel free to email me those and we will include them in the next steps. You can right now fill out our feedback survey on how this meeting went for you. Again, I wish that we could be in a room together with lots of materials and sort of tangible things, but we did our best with our virtual tools and hope that you enjoyed that activity. Also, if you'd like, feel free to share in the chat any updates, upcoming events, or resources related to what we talked about today, or just more generally that you want to share with the group. And we will look forward to seeing everyone at our next meeting in 2 weeks on February 8th. I'll stick around for questions if you all have any, but otherwise have a great day and thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you all. Please hit down on the survey so we get the thoughts.
Okay, stop this.